answer to your question can be short and long, but let me begin with a short answer. I mean, a technical way of answering is that we have a possibility of dissent. So that if you dissent with, against a certain conclusion or against a certain argument or point of view, you can quote that and say, I dissent against, and then you specify. And we have had some dissent, very little in fact, which suggests that there is some communality. But of course, there are also some difficulties in understanding or agreeing on the scope of human dignity. I mean, does it apply to blastocysts? To take a straightforward example, which has been very controversial also in our discussion. And in fact, one of the dissents we had to do with that. And if you discuss a difficult subject and a controversial subject, a subject on which there are very different views, you must expect that people in a group like ours have different views, and sometimes they cannot, these views cannot reconcile. But you have to allow time. And sometimes you need to listen to each other, and you take home what the others have said, and they take home what you have said, and you clarify certain things. And if you don't have to be hasty, then the chances are that you can agree. And if you cannot agree on specific, you can at least sometimes agree on hypothetical conclusions, if that is the case then. So certain issues are more controversial than others, and we have had some dissents.
Next question is from Sarah.
You have mentioned a number of instances where the recommendations of the EG had been taken up, or at least been discussed. Are there any failures?
You mean when yeah.
Words of wisdom fell on
yes.
stony ground?
I have two answers to that, sir. And the first is a cautionary remark. I mean, the fact that we recommend something and that the Commission then takes it up does not imply that they did it because we recommended it, because they could think for themselves and they could get this advice from other sources as well. So that, and we make that very clear. And there are certain reports which have not been successful in terms of follow-up. I know that. I mean, the nanomedicine report was very successful, and also, I think personally, the agriculture, the food, agri-food report, as we call it, that will prove to be very important because it deals with issues that are important for the survival of the humans in this world. It has not led to very much, and it's interesting to see that what politicians take up sometimes are things that are easy to do something about, like food waste. We wrote about the food waste, and it's tons of foods that are wasted. Could be used differently and better. So that was several commissioners. The Danish commissioner, for example, took that up immediately on her blog and pushed it later. But the other reports, the IT maybe was not so successful. But I mean, we are not there to represent our country, and we are not there to say what pleases the Commission. We take up certain issues, we say what we think about them, we present arguments and background information. If they follow it, it's good, it's fine. If they don't follow it, it's up to them. And the voters can have their views about whether they should or should not follow the advice. So there are both successes and failures.
I saw that you had integrity on your list of values, and I just wondered how you interpreted that in the context that you were using it, because I found myself...
It's a difficult word, because for some people integrity and human dignity are different aspects of the same value. For others it's two different values, and if you compare the Article 1 in the Oviedo Convention and the Charter of Fundamental Rights, in one it is two aspects of the same value, and the other it's two values. And so it's a matter of definition. I think sometimes it's clarifying. Again, it depends on what you discuss. Sometimes it's important to separate physical integrity. I mean, your body is your territory. No one can invade that territory without your permission. And you also have mental integrity, which comes up in the context of manipulation. You can, implants in the brain in order to manipulate people. So depending on the context, you can use it as a separate value where you focus on some specific aspect of either the territory or the mind, or in other, it's more general and an aspect of human dignity. It's an important question, but I tend to view, as I think I said, these values and the list as very general words, and then each of them, not only autonomy, integrity, and dignity, will have to be specified and interpreted depending on the context.
So you didn't mean it in terms of a country maintaining its own...
No, that certainly I did not have in mind, so I'm glad we clarified that. No, not national territory borders. That was far from what we had in mind, certainly. Very good.
Well, people are thinking of another question. I'm going to abuse my position of chair and ask a question myself. I made a joke because I forgot to ask about or point out the fire exits. But it reminds me of a problem that committees sometimes face, which is that when we're asked to address an ethical issue or a policy issue, sometimes we encounter laws and rules that require us to behave in a certain way. And you mentioned that you state the hard law and the soft law. How do you deal with that if, for example, in Europe, equality regulations or data protection regulations might drive you in a certain direction from a European perspective? Or are you at liberty to just ignore the European Union's existing positions?
I'm not sure I get it, but let me just say two things, and then we can come back to the question. I mean, if you take a human rights approach, then of course you will be, and take that seriously, then you will say things that certain politicians will not appreciate. And we can say that, we can give our reasons for it. And whether they will follow it or not is a different matter. And certainly in some countries that will be offensive to some politicians. And but I'm not sure that is what you had in mind. I think you had something else in mind.
That was part of it, but my point was also that within the European Union there are certain regulations and directives that the European Union itself is bound by, such as rules about equality or data protection. And is the European Group on Ethics trying to frame European values? Perhaps this is a problem, or perhaps it's not, because you said you would state in the preamble to the decisions the existing hard law, the existing soft law. So I just wonder how you deal with that challenge.
Let me begin with some specifics. I mean, the Biotech Directive certainly was very controversial, and we had an opinion on patenting biotechnological inventions, and with a special focus on stem cell based inventions. And we were critical against the directive. I mean, the directive was there. We were, in a way, bound to reason within that context, but it didn't prevent us from saying critical things about some of the things that the Council and the Parliament and the Commission had agreed on. And another thing, specific thing, that it became clear in nanomedicine, there is a regulation of medical devices, and there is a regulation of medicinal products. And these regulations overlap, and some nanotechnological products fall within both. One regulation is softer, the other is tougher. And we argued this is an intolerable situation, it has to be clarified. So we can criticize, and we do criticize, what has been suggested in the directives and in the regulations of the European Union. But then something else. I feel I lose something in your question.
Yeah, I think you covered it as far as you might want to, but the other issue was, for example, if, let's say, the equality regulations, they don't just apply to the countries, they apply to the union bodies. If you decided, I can't think of a situation where you wanted to say it is definitely acceptable to force disabled people to participate in which might breach one of the existing regulations. How would you deal with that breach of?
Yeah, I would suggest that the backing would be a human right. And we would say these people have the same human rights as others. And that would, if there are regulations discriminating against individuals or groups, we could criticize that on that basis. I would see no difficulty with that. I would see no difficulty with that.
I will relinquish the floor.
I wondered to what extent you wrestle with these more theoretical issues in your deliberation. I mean, just to take a couple of examples, when you set out your talk at the beginning, you said my understanding of ethics is that ethics rises where there are conflicts of interest. So I suppose the idea of the role of interest in ethics has been knocking around since at least Thrasymachus and Socrates. Socrates, I mean, part of what's going on in that debate is that Thrasymachus thinks that our interests do fundamentally conflict and Socrates doesn't, nor does Plato. So there's a central concept which obviously you mentioned comes up, you can talk about our national interest and so on, which is key in this area. I got the impression that you said at one point it's politically expedient really for us to run with the rights rhetoric, because we know that if we frame our discussions in those terms, they're more likely to be accepted because of the Convention of the United Nations. But it does, I mean, in other words, you just talk about integrity and the moral philosophy literature. There are four distinct, just the Anglo-American moral philosophy, never the European, distinct accounts, and it's a very unsettled notion of what integrity is supposed to come to.
Yes, I know that.
But I just wonder to what extent you have, I mean, these are time-consuming issues, and you've got practical matters.
Yes.
To what extent you have the opportunity to debate these theoretical issues?
I'm glad that you asked this particular question for several reasons. One is that I am a philosopher, so that's my background, philosophy. And so I'm somewhat familiar with this literature. And so I have also given some thought I've asked myself, what I learned in philosophy, to what extent has that been useful in this work? And I think honestly, not the fine details of Kantian, utilitarian, or whatever philosophy. What has been important has been the critical training, the ability to make distinctions, the familiarity with certain arguments, and to engage in a philosophical discussion with different people, asking them for evidence and for how they, like you did when you raised the question of integrity. So that has been really useful. And because that our purpose, and that's why I mentioned the distinction between theoretical and practical ethics in the beginning, our purpose is not to be another philosophical seminar where you discuss the fine points of human rights theory or things like that, but to reach decisions and recommendations. And that is then that sort of philosophical training and background that really is helpful and also I think is appreciated in that particular context. So I'm glad you asked this question because it may be on the mind of many others as well. But maybe I should say that the importance of the starting point interests is that it's also pragmatic and because you need to remind yourself that it's not just a matter of which interest, but also whose interest. I mean, in a political context, there are lobby groups, people pressing for certain things, and you cannot discuss this in an abstract way. You must put it in the context. And also, when we take up the human rights approach, it's not just a question of political expediency. I mean, some of us really are human rights theorists. We believe that this is the way to go, also for other reasons than expediency.
As a bad chair there, I tried to interrupt and then gave up because of the conversation. By the room clock, it is now 7 o'clock. By my watch, we are 5 minutes late for dinner. Therefore, I'll call the close for this evening. Can we have one more round of applause?